Welcome to the Untold Tales audio anthology, written and narrated by Dr. Jeffrey A. Robinson. The Grand Tour. There were no clouds in the sky that day at Millennium Park. The sun shined so bright that I found myself squinting as I studied the large, mirror-covered sculpture more commonly known as the Bean. The huge, curved object reflected distorted images of the Chicago skyline behind me and made me look tiny despite only standing a few feet away. Checking my watch, I noted that my wife was late, though her tardiness was not unexpected. That morning, she'd decided to go shopping in some of the downtown stores, while I wandered the large plaza near the Lake Michigan shore. I figured she had either lost track of time or been delayed by Chicago traffic. In either case, I'd planned to take my time wandering through the park and visiting the different landmarks. This was my first time in Chicago, and I found the Bean particularly captivating. It was approaching noon, and I had purchased a frozen gelato from a nearby street vendor and nearly laughed at my image in the convex mirror before me. I looked like a small, fat child holding an ice cream cone and glanced nervously as I became quite self-conscious. As I scanned my surroundings, I found there was almost no one in the large open courtyard. I mentally shrugged and figured it was just the time of day when everyone was eating lunch instead of walking around outside. I continued examining the twisted reflections on the surface of the abstract monument before me, and then noticed something unusual behind me. Turning around, I found myself standing in front of a different, perfectly reflecting object, very much like the mirrored bean behind me. It was considerably smaller and ovoid-shaped. I would have sworn it hadn't been there just a moment before. The object rose to a height of about 10 feet and was only about 3 feet wide. Overall, it resembled a large pillar or column of metal that was tapered at both ends. The strangest thing about it, however, was that it seemed to be floating about a foot above the ground. I reached out to touch it, but just before I made contact, a dark vertical line appeared on its surface, and it opened lengthwise like a door. I gasped as I stared up into the face of an older but distinguished-looking gentleman who seemed to be in costume. He was dressed as an old-fashioned carnival barker. He wore a black waistcoat with wide lapels and an anachronistic top hat. He also had a large mustache that curled up at the ends. Leaning out of the doorway, he smiled at me and said, "Would you perhaps be Mr. Ed Windershin?" I was so startled that I simply nodded yes, and was even more surprised when he said, "Excellent! You're right on time. Come on in." Then, grasping my arm, he pulled me through the doorway. Dropping my ice cream, I stumbled forward, catching myself on a handrail just inside. Pulling myself upright, I stood in shock and looked around. The room inside was far too large to be the inside of the silver monolith I'd entered. The chamber spanned at least 30 feet across and was circular in shape. The walls on one half of the room looked like windows, but I decided they had to be video screens of some sort that showed a view of the plaza outside. The rest of the walls were covered with console screens and electronics of some kind. Turning quickly, I noticed that the door was gone, and the strange man stood next to me, smiling cheerfully. "Windershin," he said. "That's quite an unusual name." I stuttered, not quite sure what to say. "Yes, it's an old Scottish name." "Mine too," he said loudly. "My name is Crichton, Robert Crichton, but you can just call me Bob, and I'll be your guide and pilot for your surprise tour." Now I was really confused. None of this made any sense. But maybe my wife had signed me up for some kind of city tour, and maybe this guy was some kind of comedian or stage magician performing optical illusions around me. Really? I asked. This is just a tour? Oh, no, sir, said Bob loudly. This is a grand tour. An exclusive excursion offered only to our most special clients, but you don't have to worry. While it's our most expensive package, it's already paid for, and since we have a schedule to keep, we should get underway. With that, he took my arm and led me to the center of the room, helping me up onto a small raised dais that was located there. Now face the screen so you don't miss anything, and please hold on to the handrail. You shouldn't experience any sense of motion at all when we travel through time, but some people get disoriented by the images that are displayed, and a few experience a little vertigo. I was sure I'd misunderstood what he'd said and started to ask, "Did you say time travel? Isn't that—" No, he said, interrupting me. "You've undoubtedly heard all the stories about how dangerous time travel is, that it can create paradoxes, disrupt entire timelines, and even alter reality as we know. But our company, Trans-Temporal Excursions Limited, has obtained special license from the government to use time travel technology because, you see, we never actually arrive. Except for our pickup point, we never quite stop traveling through time, though we sometimes move very slowly so we can peek out at places in the past that are of particular interest. Technically, we always remain outside the time stream, so there's no danger of us inadvertently altering reality by changing events or contaminating the world with modern diseases, or worse, accidentally bringing diseases back with us to the present. Trust me, Mr. Wittershin, it's all handled automatically, so it's totally and completely safe." By this time, I was beginning to question my sanity. None of this made any sense. Was I hallucinating? Could I have fallen and hit my head? Could this be a dream of some kind? As I stood at my location in the center of the room, the images in front of me shifted and flickered. I appeared to be moving at great speed, so fast that the images before me became indistinct and blurry. My hands tightened on the handrail before me, and I think I might have fallen if it hadn't been there. In the meantime, Bob kept talking. "Let me see," he said. "My records indicate that you took one of our excursions a few years ago and enjoyed it immensely. Last time you opted for Wonders of the World. I remember we traveled back to when the Great Pyramid of Giza had just been finished, and you could see it in all its grandeur. On that trip, you surely remember we also visited the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Lighthouse of Alexandria. But we also threw in a few others, like the Great Pyramid of Cholula, a monument that was more than twice the volume of the Egyptian pyramids, and you saw it at the height of its glory, glistening in gold and gemstones before it was swallowed up and lost in the Amazon jungle. We also showed you the Roman Colosseum before it was destroyed, the Mayan metropolis of Chichen Itza and the lost city of Shambhala, high in the Himalayas before it was lost and destroyed by landslides and earthquakes. Don't you remember?" he asked. I nodded, trying to indicate that it was true. I didn't remember, but I think he misunderstood me. "Well, enough of that," said Bob. "This time you've been selected to experience the greatest disasters of all time tour. Are you ready for your first stop? Because we're almost there." The images on the screen continued to spin furiously, and I had to steady myself once more so I wouldn't fall. When the flickering finally stopped, the view in the ceiling-to-floor displays in front of me showed a scene of incredible beauty. We hovered over a vast lake that stretched almost to the horizon to the east. However, the entire northern portion of the lake was bounded by a massive glacier that rose hundreds of feet into the air. "What you see right now," said Bob, "is a scene from 18,000 years ago. This is Lake Missoula, a vast inland sea in northern America that existed for several thousand years at the end of the last ice age. As the Cordilleran ice sheet that covered much of North America and Canada melted, they formed a massive series of freshwater lakes that covered much of eastern Washington, Idaho, and Montana. At its peak, it rivaled the size of the current Great Lakes, and for a time was the largest body of fresh water west of the Mississippi. However, since it was blocked by a massive ice dam to the west, it continued to grow until, one warm summer's day, the blockage burst and released all the water. As I stared at the scene, a massive wall of ice crumbled, and the water behind it poured in a torrent, slowly draining the lake, pushing ice and rock before it. Eventually, the water reached the mountains where a cliff face dropped more than 400 feet and created this. The scene shifted, and I watched a wall of water 100 feet high wash over a dry cliff, creating a massive waterfall. Bob continued. As the lake continued to drain, it formed a waterfall twice the height of Niagara Falls and 4 times as wide. For a time, the water passing over that cliff raced at 65 miles per hour. The ice dam reformed several times over the next few centuries, and each time massive floods resulted when it remelted. Overall, it took nearly 1,000 years to drain that network of lakes, and over that time it carved that cliff face 14 miles back into the mountains. The cliff is called Dry Falls now, but for a time it hosted the largest waterfall that ever existed. I found myself utterly speechless and could only stare at the majestic images before me. We will probably never see the likes of such a scene again. I guess Bob was waiting for me to respond, because he let me watch for quite a long time before he said, "Well, it's time to see our next disaster." And then he hit a button on the console next to him. The view screen shifted as we raced to a different time and location. This next disaster is really quite special, and we'll have to watch it from further away. The images stopped, and I looked down at the Earth from out in space quite far above. Moreover, our vantage point was from behind a large rock that seemed to slowly rotate as it rushed toward the planet. "This time," said Bob, "is more than 66 million years ago, and that is the Chicxulub asteroid, a rock more than 9 miles across that's approaching Earth at a speed of more than 15,000 miles per hour. If you remember your elementary school science classes, you may recall that this is the meteor that wiped out the dinosaurs, along with 3/4 of all plant and animal species. It hit the Earth near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico with devastating effect." Bob's timing was perfect, for just as he finished his sentence, the asteroid breached the atmosphere and disappeared in a flash of bright light that looked like 1,000 nuclear explosions. The view slowly panned back to show the extent of that explosion. In the seconds that followed, glowing debris was thrown high into space. I watched in awe as I saw the edge of the shock waves slowly expand. It was then that I realized that it was likely traveling faster than the speed of sound. Still, from our vantage point, the growing edge of that devastation seemed to barely crawl across the surface below us. Bob's commentary continued. The devastation within 1,000 miles of the impact resulted in total annihilation. The debris scattered by the explosion threw rocks so far that some of them reached the moon. others continued to rain down on the planet for days. The resultant impact created a crater more than 150 kilometers across and generated a mega tsunami that measured a mile high. The scene shifted and descended closer to the ground. Here is a view of that mile-high tsunami wave that reached the African coast more than 8 hours later. I watched in silence as I witnessed the unimaginable. A wall of water approached the shore and swallowed up the land without the slightest sign of slowing down. It looked as if the land simply sank beneath the water. To appreciate the magnitude of this event, we can compare it to the Sumatra tsunami in 2004 that followed a 9.2 magnitude earthquake. This impact was more than 30,000 times greater than that incident. By this time, I was reaching information overload. The images before me became unreal, and I felt like I was watching some science fiction horror movie. But Bob's tour guide monologue continued. It took days before dust and debris spanned the Atlantic. It took weeks before the clouds of smoke and steam circled the planet and blocked out the sun. The result killed almost all plant life and created a winter that lasted 1,000 years. What emerged from that Holocaust millennia later was an entirely different world. But we'll show you a bit more, but we can't linger. Next, we see the devastation caused by the explosion of the Yellowstone caldera 700,000 years ago. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I turned toward Bob and confronted him. "What is this?" I demanded. "This is not something that I want to see. This is horrible. How could anybody want to see this?" Bob blinked in surprise. "But this is one of our most popular excursions." "Just wait," he said, raising his hand to calm me. "The next disaster that we visit is truly unique and intriguing. It shows how a supernova, a mere 16 light-years away, exploded about 443 million years ago. It was brighter than the sun and irradiated the surface of the planet so heavily that it triggered the Ordovician Silurian extinction, wiping out more than 97% of all species alive at the time." My face must have shown my disgust so strongly that Bob actually recoiled, taking a step back. Wait," he stuttered. "We have a money-back guarantee, of course, if you're dissatisfied with the tour for any reason, but at least stay to see the great tsunami of 2144 that was triggered by an undersea landslide near the New England seamounts, which generated a 200-foot tidal wave that swept across the eastern seaboard and wiped out Boston, New York, and Washington, resulting in the greatest loss of life of any natural disaster in history." "And that," I shouted, spraying spittle on him as I screamed, "is exactly why I don't want to see it. I mean, how could anyone enjoy watching such devastation and destruction, such a horrific loss of life?" Bob pressed a button on his console, turning off the massive view screens. "Well, there must have been some misunderstanding, Mr. Wittershin. I know this excursion was supposed to be a surprise gift from your grandchildren, but I was assured that they'd confirmed that these were the types of things you wished you'd seen during your first tour." "And that's another thing," I shouted. "There must be some kind of mix-up. I do have grandchildren, but the twins are only 5 years old, so I seriously doubt they could have arranged anything like this." I spread my arms to indicate the chamber around me. "Oh, no," said Bob. "There can't be a mistake." Tapping a nearby console, he said, "Computer, show me the reservation documents for Mr. Wittershin." The screen next to him flickered, and he pointed at the information there. "See? This is the confirmation for your scheduled tour. I was supposed to pick up Edward Wintershin here at Millennium Park at precisely noon on October 1st, 2420. Well, I said sharply, that's your mistake right there. My name is Edmund Wintershin, not Edward. And while you did pick me up on October 1st, the year was 2024, not 2420. You arrived 400 years too early. Bob frowned, turning hurriedly back to his console. He tapped several keys, calling up several screens of information before straightening up and saying, you appear to be correct. Someone made a clerical error and transposed the digits in the pickup date. It seems the tour was to be gifted to your great-great-grandson, Edward, 4 centuries from your pickup date, and the tour was arranged and gifted to him by his 4 grown grandchildren as a gift for his 80th birthday. So, I asked, crossing my arms angrily, what do we do now? Bob paused for a moment and then abruptly dropped back into his Carnival Barker persona. Well, that concludes your scheduled tour with Trans-Temporal Excursions, he said, quickly grabbing me by my elbow and dragging me along the bank of electronic workstations. In accordance with our satisfaction guarantee, I'll return you to your pickup point and assure you there will be nothing charged to your financial accounts. A doorway opened in the wall next to me, and as I looked out, I saw the now familiar Chicago Bean just a few yards away. Then, as he roughly pushed me through the door, he added, "Please don't hesitate to contact us again for other excursion destinations. Thank you for your time and participation, and have a very good day." I stumbled and nearly fell as I passed through the doorway. My foot slid on something slippery, and I looked down to see that I'd stepped on a half-melted ice cream cone. Glancing behind me, I didn't see this silver object that had been there just seconds before, and wondered once more if I was losing my mind. Searching for any sign that anything had actually happened to me, I spied my wife approaching from the edge of the plaza, waving at me to get my attention. I waved back and smiled, wondering what the hell I was going to say if she asked me what I had been doing all morning. Thank you for listening. As you know by now, we love our listeners, fans, patrons, and supporters. Please let us know what you think of our podcast and our stories. The best way to do that is to subscribe to our podcast at untold-tales.com. By doing so, you'll be added to our mailing list so you can be notified of upcoming episodes, blogs, and other information. Thanks again for listening, and have a great day.